So first, let's review what we have discussed in the last lecture. The first important result is about firm's supply curve. So basically, it starts with the firm's maximization problem. If it's a competitive firm, then its maximized profit is determined by price equals quantity, right? So we have, okay, let me find a nicer picture. Okay, maybe I would just use this one. So if its price is P1, then price crosses marginal cost curve will give us this point. And the Q1 would be the quantity, the output, to maximize this firm's profit at price P1. And then we discussed what is this firm's supply curve, right? To summarize, in the short run, right? If the firm does not shut down, then marginal cost curve is this firm's supply curve. That is, for the portion of the marginal cost curve which is above the average variable cost, then it is the supply curve. Right? So this part is the supply curve. And if price drops below the shutdown price, then the firm will just shut down. So we get a vertical line, which is the supply curve if the price is too low. And then very similarly, in the long run, when the firm can exit, its supply curve will be the marginal cost curve above the average total cost curve. And this vertical line below this exit price. And then we discussed the firm's long-run equilibrium. So we got this following result. We know that in the long run, price equals marginal cost equals average total cost. The reason is because first, we understand that if the firm is maximizing its profit, then we have P equals MC. And we also has made this argument that because of the entry and exit in the long run, a competitive firm will earn zero profit. So P equals average total cost. Then in the end, this implies if you combine these two results, P equals marginal cost equals average total cost. And if we look at this picture on this left-hand side, you can see that this implies the quantity will be determined by the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the average total cost. Right? So this is essentially the efficient scale. And we have learned about the definition of the efficient scale, which is the quantity level minimizing the average total cost. Right? So basically you can see that under a competitive market, firms are very efficient. Firms are producing at the lowest average total cost curve. Right? Now, let's look at the picture on the right-hand side. So it tells you the market supply curve. You can see that in the long run, the market supply curve is horizontal, right? It is entirely, totally flat. So why do we get this kind of result? Well, the reason is because if you look at this condition here, right, you can see that P equals marginal cost equals average total cost. And if we assume all firms in the market, they have the same technology, and if we assume average total cost and marginal cost stay the same, then you can see that essentially the price is determined by technology. That is, price is determined by marginal cost and average total cost, right? To be more specific, price is determined by the minimum point of the average total cost, right? So you can see that no matter what is the quantity, if firm's average total cost curve stays the same, then price will stay the same. And you can see that's why price will be a horizontal line. So what does this tell us? it basically tells us that in the long run, right, price is entirely determined by the firm's technology. So you can contrast this with the short-term supply curve. So here here on the right-hand side, we're looking at the market supply curve for a fixed number of firms, and we have discussed this. The reason we can assume a fixed number of firms is really because we're only looking at the short term. And in the short term, there is no entry or exit. So the number of firms is fixed. In this case, you can see that we're getting this very normal supply curve, right? It is upward sloping. But in the long run, because of the entry and exit, you will get this line as the supply curve. And very soon you will see several nice pictures which tell you exactly how could you get this sort of horizontal line as the supply curve. Okay, now you might wonder why do firms stay in business if they make zero profit, right? Because we know that in the competitive market, in the long run, competitive firms will just make zero profit. So why do they want to still operate, right? Well, the reason is because here, zero profit essentially means zero economic profit. However, firms could still make positive accounting profit. So let's see this example here. Let's say a farmer invests $1 million to build his farm. And we assume the farmer's implicit cost is $80,000 because he could have earned $50,000 in interest by depositing $1 million. And he also could have earned $30,000 in salary by working a different job. So you can see that here essentially opportunity cost equals 1 plus 0.8, right? And this 1 is explicit opportunity cost. And this 0.8 is implicit opportunity cost, right? So let's assume the farmer's farm has a revenue of $1.8 million. So you can see that the economic profit would be revenue minus total opportunity cost, which is 1.8. So this is 0. But if you look at the accounting profit, then the revenue would be 1.8, but the accountant would only record this $1 million investment, right? So the cost would be just 1. And then there would be $0.8 million of profit. Okay, as I said, I will show you several pictures which shows you how how entry and exit in the long run will give us a horizontal supply curve. So let's see how this works. So first, let's say the market is in equilibrium. That is, if you look at this left-hand side, we're looking at a competitive firm. So you can see that it satisfies price equals marginal cost equals average total cost. So this firm is earning zero economic profit. And on this right-hand side, we're looking at the market supply curve and market demand curve. So here, you can see that we have two kinds of supply curves. This one is supply curve in the short term, right? And we talk about this in the short term because the number of firms is fixed. So we have a upward sloping supply curve. And then in the long run, the supply curve will be a horizontal line, right? So we have two different supply curves here. Now let's say there's some external change happening in the market. To be more specific, let's assume there is a demand shock, and it's a positive demand shock. That is, demand increases. Obviously, we have learned about different reasons which could increase demand curve in chapter 4, right? We could say this is a normal good and income increases. Or we could say people have better expectations. Right? So now let's just say due to some reasons, the demand increases. In this case, you can see that in the short run, right? If we're just thinking about short run, if we're just trying to think what is the price and quantity in the short term, then we should use the short term supply curve as one. Right? So basically, you can see that the price would increase from P1 to P2, and the quantity would increase from Q1 to Q2. Now, what is this effect on firm's profit? So let's move to the left-hand side. Right? The picture on the left shows you that for a competitive firm, right, because price increases, it will earn a positive economic profit, because we know that profit equals P minus average total cost times quantity. So you can see that this gray shaded area gives us the firm's economic profit. The key here is profit is positive. Now you can imagine that if there is positive profit in the market, this positive profit will attract entry, right? So new firms will enter into this market, try to get this positive profit. So there will be new firms entering into this market. Then you can see that what we would imagine is the short-term supply curve will get pushed to the right. That is, supply will increase. Because we learned in chapter 4, if we have more firms in the market, supply curve will move to the right. Supply will increase. Right? So the implication of the shift of this supply curve is the price will be lower and quantity will be higher. So we essentially move from point B to point C, right? So you can also see the path of the equilibrium points. So in the beginning, we were at point A, and then the demand shock will push the equilibrium from A to B. And then new entry of firms will push the equilibrium point from B to C. And what's interesting here is you can see that in the end, the price will get dropped back to P1 and quantity will increase, right? So this basically tells you that in the long run, the price will always stay at this P1. And you can see that P1 is determined by the minimum point of this ATC curve. So, and you can also see that you're getting two different kinds of quantities under price P1, right? So we're getting essentially a horizontal line as the long run supply curve. Okay, so the quick quiz asks, in the long run with free entry and exit, is the price in the market equal to marginal cost, average total cost, both, or neither? We learned that in the long run, price equals marginal cost equals average total cost. So the answer here is both, right? Explain with the diagram. Well, you have the ATC here, and you have the marginal cost here, and we know that from the last chapter, right? We know that marginal cost always intersects the ATC curve at its lowest point, and then price will be equal to the minimum point of the ATC curve, and then quantity will be determined by this point. Right? Okay, great. Now let's look at several true-false questions. First, the long-run equilibrium in a competitive market characterized by firms with identical costs is generally characterized by firms operating at efficient scale. So here we have a market with identical firms. Oops. And we know that in the long run, the firms will operate at efficient scale, right? The reason is because the quantity will stay at the lowest point on this average total cost curve. And we know that that's exactly the definition of efficient scale. When a profit maximizing firm in a competitive market experiences rising prices, it will respond with an increase in production. This is definitely correct, right? Because we know that if you draw out the firm's profit maximization problem, then you can see that if the initial price is P1, and after that, if initial price is P2, you can see that quantity 2 will be larger, right? Essentially, this is because most of the time, marginal cost curve is a competitive firm's supply curve, and we know that marginal cost curve is upward sloping. So if price increases, then quantity increases. For a farmer facing a long-run decision of whether to exit the market or not, the cost of her land is not considered to be sunk. So here we are thinking about a long-run decision. And you can see that if you are talking about whether to exit the market, then fixed cost is not really fixed, because in this case you can see that the farmer can basically rent out his land or sell his land if he decides to exit the market. So in this case, the cost of land is not sunk. So the answer here is true. The short-run supply curve in a competitive market must be more elastic than the long-run supply curve. Well, this one has been discussed in previous chapters. You can see that it is not correct, because we know that in the long run, a firm can actually make more adjustments. This basically means there is higher elasticity in the long run. So supply curve will be more elastic. You can also see this if you compare the short-run supply curve and the long-run supply curve. So short-run supply curve generally looks like this, and then long-run supply curve looks like this. And we know that the horizontal line has the largest possible elasticity. To be more precise, if a supply curve is a horizontal line, then the elasticity is actually infinite. So it's infinitely large. So in this case, it is true. Fifth, all of the following conditions are consistent with a firm's decision to shut down. So the first one is total revenue is smaller than variable cost, and average revenue is smaller than average variable cost. And you can see that from our lecture note, you know that these two conditions are correct for shutting down. And then the third one is P smaller than marginal revenue. Well, this is definitely not correct. We never mentioned it about P smaller than marginal revenue as the condition for a firm to shut down. And you can see that we know that if it's a competitive firm, price equals marginal revenue, right? We could never get P smaller than marginal revenue. So this is definitely not right. Now 6, for a firm in a competitive market, marginal revenue is always equal to average revenue. Well, we talk about this. So marginal revenue equals average revenue equals price. Oh, and you can actually very quickly to see why this is true. So let's say, okay, so average revenue equals total revenue divided by quantity. So this gives us price, right? And then marginal revenue. So let's say we have two quantities, Q2 larger than Q1. And then the change in total revenue would be PQ2 minus PQ1. And then you can see that Q2 and Q1 will just cancel out. So this again gives us price P. A firm will shut down in the short run if revenue is not sufficient to cover its variable cost. Well, this is definitely correct, right? So TR smaller than variable cost, the firm will shut down. A profit maximizing firm in a competitive market earns zero accounting profit. So this is not correct. In the long run, a firm earns zero economic profit. So you can see that we should choose false here. 9th, when a firm experiences zero profit equilibrium, the firm's revenue must be sufficient to cover all opportunity cost. So here we know that there is zero profit. Essentially, it means total revenue minus total opportunity cost equals 0. So obviously, revenue equals opportunity cost. This is equivalent to say revenue is sufficient to cover all opportunity costs. So the statement here is correct. A firm will shut down in the short run if revenue is not sufficient to cover all of its fixed cost. So you can see that this statement is not correct because the correct condition is total revenue smaller than variable cost. However, here, this statement mentions fixed cost. In fact, in the short run, we know that fixed cost is a sunk cost, and you should not consider sunk cost into your shutdown decision. So this is false here. Okay, 11th. Firms in competitive markets are said to be price takers. Oh, this is definitely correct. By comparing marginal revenue and marginal cost from each unit produced, a firm in a competitive market can determine the profit maximizing level of production. So we know that for a competitive firm, its profit maximizing condition is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So this is essentially equivalent to say the firm is comparing marginal revenue and marginal cost. So we can see that this statement here is correct. 13. In making a short-run profit maximizing production decision, a firm must consider both fixed and variable cost. So here we're thinking about short run. And you can see that, again, either shutting down decision or profit maximizing decision. Fixed cost should not play a role, right? So the firm should not consider the role of fixed cost because it is a sunk cost. So this is false. 14th, in competitive markets, firms that raise their prices are typically rewarded with larger profit. Well, this sounds right? But it's not, because it's a competitive market. So if it's a competitive market, it means all firms are price takers. The implication of this statement is if a firm tries to increase its price, then all customers will just turn away to other firms, to other sellers. So a firm raising its price will have zero customer and it will have zero revenue. So it will not earn any profit. So this is so the statement here is false. Okay, last one. The supply curve of a firm in a competitive market is the average variable cost curve above the minimum of marginal cost. Now, this is definitely not correct, right? Because you can see that the correct statement is you have to exchange average variable cost for marginal cost, right? So you have to put marginal cost here, and then exchange marginal cost for average variable cost. So you can see that the correct statement is the supply curve of a firm in a competitive market is the marginal cost curve above the minimum of average variable cost. Okay, good. Let's move to the next chapter, which should be chapter 15, Monopoly. Okay. So first, what is monopoly? It's actually pretty simple to define monopoly. It basically says in a market there is only one seller. Then this sole seller in the market is a monopolist. Right? For example, if you think about Manitoba Hydro in Winnipeg, then the market for electricity is a monopoly market, right? Because we only have Manitoba Hydro as the only seller of electricity. You don't have other choices. So this is an example of monopoly. Now, let's first understand why there are monopolies. So essentially we ask why monopolies arise. There are three reasons. The first one is monopoly resources. So essentially, a key resource is owned by a single firm. Then naturally, this firm will become a monopolist, right? Say we have this fictional example. So let's say if you control all flour in this whole world, then your pizza chain will definitely become a monopoly, right? However, you can see that this example is fictional because in reality, generally monopolies don't arise because of this reason. The reason is because for the past several decades, we have international trade, right? And we have this fast pace of globalization, right? And both international trade and globalization actually create a worldwide market for all kinds of resources. So it's very hard to find a firm which controls all the inputs. Okay. The second reason is the monopoly is created by government policies. So essentially, sometimes government will use its policy to give a single firm or even a single person the sole right, the exclusive right to produce some product or service. Right? For example, in reality, we have patent and we have copyright. Right? Essentially, patent and copyright will generate government-created monopolies. So why do government wants to do this? Well, the reason is because government wants to use patent and copyright laws to provide incentive for innovation and some maybe some creation, right? So both for innovation and creation. Of course, the cost is monopoly. For example, if you think about Harry Potter, right? So clearly J.K. Rowling has the copyright. And no one can sell J.K. Rowling's book without her permission. So this is essentially to say this person, this writer, J.K. Rowling, is a monopoly in Harry Potter series. Now, patent, this is like everywhere. And this is also a very important phenomenon in pharmaceutical industry, right? So if you think about the big pharma, right, Pfizer. So this is a very large pharmaceutical firm. So Pfizer got some patent, let's say for a specific drug. It's called Lyrica. Let's say if it has the patent for 10 years, then essentially it means Pfizer, this firm, will be the monopolist for the product Lyrica for 10 years. Right? So it's a government-created monopoly through the patent system. Again, you can see why do we have these copyright laws and patent laws. So if you don't give copyright to J.K. Rowling, then possibly she would not write she would not write Harry Potter, right? And if you don't give patent to the firm Pfizer, then Pfizer would not have any incentive to invent new drugs. Okay. The third reason is called natural monopoly. So this type of monopoly arises because of technological reasons. To be more specific, if a single firm can produce output at a lower cost than larger number of firms, then this monopoly will arise and it will be called natural monopoly. So let's see how this works. Essentially, natural monopoly arises because a single firm has a smaller cost than two or more firms. And the fundamental reason is the economies of scale. So if you look at this picture here, you will get a very good understanding why natural monopolies can arise. So if you look at this average total cost curve, what you can see here is over the entire range of the output, the average total cost always decreases. It means, let's say if this is, so let's say this is 1 million, right? So this number is 1 million, let's say 1 million cars. But let's say if we want to build a car factory in Winnipeg, so let's say Winnipeg's population is 0.8 million. So what you can see here is if we let one firm to supply cars to Winnipeg, then the firm will produce this amount, 0.8 million cars, and its cost will be here. So let's call this P1, that is one firm's cost. Yeah, maybe let me call this C1, that is one firm's cost. Now let's say you don't like monopoly, because if there's only one firm selling cars in Winnipeg, it is monopoly, right? So let's say you want two car manufacturers, and each of them will supply 0.8 million cars in Winnipeg. Now what you can see here is, if there are two firms in Winnipeg, their cost will be higher, right? So you can see that the fundamental reason is because the market in Winnipeg is not large enough. And even supply cars to all people in Winnipeg, we will still be on this downward sloping average total cost curve. So in this case, you will want only one firm to manufacture cars in Winnipeg, because in this case, you will obtain lower cost, right? So it's very easy to see why one car manufacturer gets lower cost than two car manufacturer. And you can see that it's really because of technological reason. Okay. What are three reasons that a market might have a monopoly? Well, to summarize, right, the first is the firm controls the input. That is, the firm has a monopoly on the input. And the second is government created monopoly. To be more specific, it's because of patent and copyright laws. Third, it's natural monopoly. It is called natural because it arises not because of policy, it's because of technological reason. So give two examples of monopolies and explain the reason for each. Well, if you think about Winnipeg, right? So first we have Manitoba Hydro. It is a monopoly, and you can see that Manitoba Hydro is a monopoly. Potentially, it's because of technological reasons. That is, this is a natural monopoly, right? Because if you want to supply electricity to the whole city, then you have to pay a large fixed cost to build this basic infrastructure, right? So you can imagine that the ATC curve for Manitoba Hydro always decreases. Maybe it will decrease into 2 million households. But Winnipeg, let's say Winnipeg has 0.2 million households, maybe 0.3 households. So in this case, it is better to just let Manitoba to serve as a natural monopoly, to serve all people in Winnipeg, right? And then, what's the second example of monopoly? So let's say MPI, right? So Manitoba Public Insurance has a monopoly over car insurance, right? And you can see that it's highly possible it's government created. And what's the reason? Well, I don't know. I guess because Manitoba government has some monopoly fantasies. Okay, now let's see the second part. So now we want to understand how a monopolist determines its output, right? And how a monopolist determines its price. So if you think about the fundamental difference between the monopoly market versus a competitive market, then you would see that we have only one seller in the monopoly market, right? So what is the implication here? It basically implies that under the monopoly market, the monopolist will be able to influence the price of its output because it is the only seller. So it has market power. So essentially you can see that firms in competitive market are just price takers, but the firm in the monopoly market is a price maker. So this is the most fundamental difference. Now, why do we get this result? Well, we can also think about this from the perspective of demand curves. So now let's think about the demand curve that each firm faces. So now we're not talking about the market demand curve. We're talking about the demand curve faced by each firm. Now, on the left-hand side, we have demand curve faced by a competitive firm. So here, you can see that the demand curve faced by a competitive firm is actually horizontal, right? So why do you get this result? Well, think about this. It's a competitive firm. So if it increases its price, it will sell nothing. Or you could say it's a competitive firm. So no matter what kind of quantity it wants to produce, the price should be the same because the firm has no ability to affect the market price. So you can see that during all the ranges of the outputs, price is the same. So the demand curve faced by the competitive firm is horizontal. Okay, now let's look at the right-hand side. This is the demand curve faced by a monopolist. So in this case, what you can see here is it is downward sloping, right? It's the most different feature compared with the demand curve faced by a competitive firm. So why? Well, the reason is because the market demand curve will be the demand curve faced by the monopolist. Clearly, that's because monopolist is the only seller in the market. And you can see that it basically means if the monopolist wants to sell a larger quantity, then the price will be lower, right? Okay. To understand how a monopolist determines its quantity and price, we have to first think about a monopolist's revenue. So clearly you can imagine that every firm will want to sell at a higher price and sell a larger quantity. But you can see that in the monopolist market, because the demand curve is downward sloping. So if the firm wants to sell a larger quantity, it has to face a lower price. If the firm wants to charge a higher price, it has to sell at a lower quantity. So basically this means the market demand curve puts a constraint on the monopolist's power to profit from this monopoly market. So now the question is, at what quantity exactly the monopolist will want to produce to maximize its profit? So let's see this example here. So this is an example of a utility firm. So let's assume this is a water supply firm. And we have quantities, we have prices, total revenues, average revenues, and marginal revenues. Again, it's very easy for you to find out these numbers, right? So let's just pick one row and see how could we get these numbers. Okay, so basically given quantity of 3 and price of 8, the total revenue would be 24. It's just 3 times 8. And average revenue would be 24 divided by 3, which is 8. And what about marginal revenue? So we can see that if the firm increases quantity from 2 to 3, then marginal revenue is given by 6, right? So basically it's 24 minus 18, that is the change in the total revenue, divided by the change in the quantity, 3 by 2. This gives us 6. Okay. That's very easy to calculate. Okay, what you can see here is, so if you look at the marginal revenue, you can see one thing here. You can see that marginal revenue actually changes, right? Recall what we have learned in the chapter of competitive firm. We learned marginal revenue always equals the market price, right? But what you can see here is marginal revenue actually from 10 to minus 4, right? So as you increase the quantity of output, marginal revenue decreases. So this is the first observation you can get from this example. So this basically tells you that marginal revenue is downward sloping. Okay. Now, let's think about the second, or let's observe the second feature. That is, I can see that marginal revenue is always smaller than price. So how do you see this? Well, you can see that 10 is smaller than 11, 8 smaller than 10, 6 smaller than 9, and you can continue to do this. You can see that at any quantity, marginal revenue is always smaller than price. So this tells you that marginal revenue is smaller than price, or it tells us marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve, right? Why do we give this? Well, it's actually very easy to understand. So let's say this is the demand curve. Then marginal revenue curve has to be look like this. That's how you get marginal revenue smaller than price, because this is the price and this is the marginal revenue, right? So you can only get marginal revenue smaller than price if marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve, right?